to start today with a question that it sounds really simple on the surface, but the second you start to pull at the thread, the whole sweater of history just, it unravels.
It's the big one, isn't it? The fundamental question of, well, everything. Sociology, history.
It really is. How did men actually gain the control to regulate the world?
And we're not just talking about the obvious stuff.
No, not just who runs the government or who gets to lead the armies. I'm talking about the really granular day-to-day control.
Right.
From deciding which wars get fought all the way down to what time dinner should be on the table or who's expected to do the dishes. How did we end up in a system where, for the vast majority of recorded history, one gender has held the pen?
Well, the common assumption, the one we all kind of absorb by osmosis, is that male dominance patriarchy is just the natural order.
Yeah, that it's biologically inevitable. Men are physically stronger, so of course men rule. End of story.
But the stack of sources we have today, it just throws a massive wrench into that entire machine.
A huge one. Today, we are doing a deep dive into a book that is, well, it's controversial, it's definitely groundbreaking, and honestly, it's a little bit mind-bending. It's called When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone.
A true classic.
Exactly.
Published back in 1976.
Right, the disco era. But don't let that date fool you at all. This book doesn't feel outdated. If anything, it feels more relevant now than it probably did even then.
The core thesis is still so radical.
It is. Stone argues that for thousands and thousands of years, God was actually a woman.
And this is the most important part. The transition to male deities wasn't some kind of gentle, natural evolution.
Right. It wasn't a drift in fashion.
It was a hostile takeover. She frames it as a violent political suppression of a belief system that empowered women, which was then replaced by a new one specifically designed to subjugate them.
To really set the scene, and just to give you a taste of why Stone was so fired up to write this, I want to read a quote she includes right at the start of the book.
I think I know the one you mean.
It's from 1971. It's an Episcopal bishop, C.L. Myers, and he's explaining why women shouldn't be ordained as priests.
Well, it's a doozy.
It is a jaw-dropper. He says, and I'm quoting here, "A priest is a God symbol whether he likes it or not. In the imagery of both the Old and New Testament, God is represented in masculine imagery."
So logic follows.
He concludes that the priesthood is, therefore, a masculine conception.
Which is really just a very polite theological way of saying, God's a guy, so you can't be in the club.
Exactly. It just slams the door on half of the human race, purely based on the gender of a metaphor. And that is the exact point where Merlin Stone steps in.
And her background is so important here. She wasn't a traditional theologian.
No, she was a sculptor and an art historian. So she was looking at the physical evidence, the statues, the art, the archaeology, and she was saying, hang on a second, this masculine conception, it wasn't always the case.
Theologians, they often look at texts as divine law. Stone was looking at them as cultural artifacts. She was asking the hard question.
Like what?
Like, who actually wrote this? Why did they write it this way?
Yeah.
And, maybe most importantly, what stories did they have to destroy to make this the only story left in town?
That's the key. So for our deep dive today, we've got a great stack to help us navigate all this. Obviously, we have the book itself, When God Was a Woman.
The primary text.
But we also have a pretty sharp critical review from Kirkus Reviews, because we need to keep our feet on the ground. Stone isn't perfect, and we need to address that.
Absolutely. It's always good to have a skeptic in the room, so to speak.
We also have a study guide from Super Summary, which is great for keeping us structured.
Yeah.
And this is the fun one. We have a really lively discussion thread from the Reddit community, Are Witches vs. Patriarchy.
Oh, that thread is fascinating. It really shows that this isn't just dry academic history for people.
Not at all.
People feel this loss of what they call the divine feminine very, very personally. It's a deeply emotional topic.
So buckle up. We're going to try and unearth a lost history. We're going to look at the world before patriarchy, then at the bias in archaeology that literally hid it from us, the invasion that changed everything, and finally, where that all leaves us today.
And just a heads up for you listening, we're going to be doing a bit of historiography today.
Right.
Which is, a fancy word for studying how history gets written.
Right.
Because Stone's biggest, most overarching argument is that what we accept as objective history is very often just the propaganda of the winners.
Let's jump right in. Section 1. The world before. We're calling this the age of the goddess.
And we really need to get our heads around the timeline here first, because it is absolutely staggering. Stone argues that goddess worship goes back to the Upper Paleolithic era.
Okay, so we're talking, what, caveman times?
We're talking 25,000 BC.
Yeah.
And she argues it continues all the way through the Neolithic period, around 7000 BC, right up until about 500 AD.
Okay, can we just pause on that number? 25,000 BC. I think my brain and probably a lot of people's brains just glaze over when we hear dates that far back. It's just a number. Can you put that into perspective for us?
Sure. Think of it this way. If you compressed all of known human history into a single 24-hour clock,
Okay.
the period where we've had male-dominated religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, that's like the last 10 minutes before midnight, maybe less.
Wow. So we are living in the absolute tail end of the movie.
Exactly. For the vast, vast majority of the day, from the Paleolithic through the entire invention of agriculture and the founding of the first cities, the archaeological evidence suggests the primary supreme deity was female.
So this isn't a blip. It's not a short phase.
We're talking about a continuous religious tradition that lasted for a duration of time that is roughly 10 times longer than the entire age of the Bible.
It recontextualizes everything. It makes patriarchy look less like the default setting of humanity and more like a very distinct and very recent experiment.
A historical anomaly, even.
But what's the actual evidence for this? Is it just a feeling she has, or is there actual stuff we can, touch and look at?
Oh, it's the stuff. It's very tangible. Specifically, it's what archaeologists call the Venus figures.
I've definitely seen these in museums and textbooks. They're these little palm-sized sculptures.
Right, and they've been found all across the ancient world, from Spain through Europe, all the way to Siberia. It suggests a universal belief system.
And I'm looking at some of the images from the study guide now. They're very distinct. They don't usually have faces.
Exactly. The heads are often just little nubs, or they're covered in what looks like stylized braids, like the famous Venus of Willendorf. But the bodies...
The bodies are the focus. Massive breasts, very wide hips, protruding bellies.
Right, which is why, for about a century, male archaeologists looked at these and immediately labeled them fertility idols.
The assumption being what? That they were ancient pornography, or maybe good luck charms for getting pregnant.
That was the standard interpretation. Primitive man wants to have lots of babies, so he carves a statue of a pregnant woman. It's a very male gaze way of interpreting the art.
It's projecting modern ideas backward.
Completely. But Merlin Stone asks a different, more fundamental question. She says, imagine you were an early human, and you don't really understand the mechanics of conception. You don't know about sperm. So where does life come from?
It comes from women, period. Exclusively.
Think about the pure logic of what that early human would observe. A woman bleeds every month but doesn't die. That's mysterious. Her body swells up and then miraculously produces a new human being. Then she produces food from her own body to sustain that new human.
It would seem like literal magic.
But to the ancient mind, the female body wasn't just sexy or fertile. It was the engine of the entire universe. It was the source. So Stone argues these statues weren't erotica. They were theological texts written in stone. They were the universal parent, the creator.
That makes so much more sense. If you're trying to imagine the ultimate creator, you model it on the being that you see creating life right in front of your own eyes.
Precisely. And this ties into Stone's theory about how early societies understood family. She argues that the whole concept of biological paternity, the father's specific role in conception, was likely not understood, or at least not prioritized, for a long, long time.
Because the link isn't obvious.
It's not. If you don't know that a specific act of sex leads to a baby 9 months later, then the woman appears to be the sole magical producer of life. She is the source. All life flows from her.
And this brings us to the theological structure of this belief system. I think this is one of the most important points that Stone makes in the whole book.
I agree.
We have been trained, I think, to think of these female deities as just earth mothers. They're responsible for the corn growing and the seasons changing, but they aren't, running the universe.
It's a very reductive way to look at it, and it's a common trope. We tend to pigeonhole female deities into nature and male deities into civilization.
The woman gets the messy biological stuff, and the man gets the logic and the order.
Yes. But Stone goes to the ancient texts themselves, and she lists the actual titles these goddesses held. And they are so much more than Earth Mother.
Okay, let's go through some of them. First up, Queen of Heaven.
Right there, that's a huge one. Not Queen of Earth, Queen of the entire cosmos.
And there's Mistress of the House of Life.
Which sounds incredibly powerful. Like she holds the keys to existence itself.
Wise magician.
And this is a big one. Lawmaker and justice giver.
Okay, that directly contradicts the stereotype. Lawmaker.
It does. Take the deity Nidibo in ancient Sumer. She was credited as the inventor of writing.
Wait, really? The patron deity of scribes and writing was a woman?
Yes, she was the keeper of the sacred records, the one who measured the fields for farming, the patron of the entire scribal class. Just think about that for a second. Literacy, the very foundation of recorded history, of law, of civilization, was seen as the domain of the goddess.
That's a huge distinction. It implies that what we call civilization laws, writing, justice, wasn't seen as a male invention imposed on female nature. It was seen as an attribute of the divine feminine itself.
It completely subverts the narrative we've been taught.
Stone lists some of the specific names of these goddesses who were just huge in their time. We're talking about Isis in Egypt,
Ishtar in Babylon, Nana in Sumer.
the sun goddess of Arena in what's now Turkey.
And what's so fascinating is the relationship these supreme goddesses had with male figures. It wasn't that male gods didn't exist, but their status was completely different.
This is the concept of the male consort, right?
Exactly. This is a recurring pattern where the great goddess has a younger, often subordinate male partner. Figures like Tammuz or Osiris in Egypt.
And what was their role?
They often symbolize the agricultural cycle. They were the dying and resurrecting god. Tammuz dies in the heat of the summer when the plants wither, and he's mourned, and then he's reborn in the spring.
So his power is cyclical. It comes and goes.
Yes, but the goddess. She was the constant. She was the eternal supreme power who had the ability to bring him back to life. She was the one who held the ultimate authority. He was her son or her lover, but never her equal. She was the decision maker.
It's a complete inversion of the dynamic we see in later Judeo-Christian texts, where the male god is supreme and eternal, and any female figures are subordinate or just vessels.
A complete 180.
So this is the big question. If the theology put women at the top, did that actually translate to real life? Did the average woman walking around in ancient Sumer or Egypt have a better life because of this?
That's a very valid and important question, because you can, have a queen on your chessboard but still treat the women in the village terribly.
Right. Just because you worship a woman doesn't automatically mean you respect women.
True. But Stone argues, yes, absolutely, there was a direct correlation. She draws a very clear line between the gender of the supreme deity and the legal and social rights of women in that society.
What kind of rights are we talking about here? Are we talking about their right to vote?
Well, more fundamental than that. For starters, in both Egypt and Sumer, we have extensive legal and economic records showing women could own property in their own name.
Okay, that's big. For a lot of Western history, that was not the case.
Not at all. They could also run their own businesses, inherit property, and sign contracts. But the most stunning part is that they could serve as judges and magistrates.
Judges. Women were judges.
Yes. The Nimrud records, for instance, provide evidence of women serving as official magistrates. That implies a level of intellectual respect and legal authority that completely vanished in later eras.
If a woman can sit in judgment of a man in a court of law, she is fundamentally not his property.
She is his equal, at the very least. It's a completely different social structure.
And this all ties back to that idea of matrilineal descent you mentioned earlier.
It does. Stone argues that many of these early societies traced lineage through the mother. It just makes practical sense if paternity is uncertain.
So your name, your inheritance, your clan identity, it all flows through the female line.
Which centers the woman in the social fabric in a way that patrilineal systems, where everything goes from father to son, simply don't. The mother is the anchor of the family and the society.
It really paints a picture of a world that it's almost unrecognizable to us now. A world where God was a she, and that wasn't some radical modern political statement.
It was just reality. It was the norm, the air they breathed.
So here's the million-dollar question. If the evidence is there, the thousands of statues, the temple inscriptions, the legal records of women judges, why don't we know this? Why did I grow up thinking history started with a bunch of men in togas debating philosophy in Greece?
Well, that is a very loaded question. And it brings us directly to section 2 of our deep dive, the dig, or maybe more accurately, excavating the bias.
Okay, I want to circle back to something you said at the top of the show, that we don't know this history because it was effectively erased. And Stone spends a huge chunk of her book just roasting modern archaeologists.
Roasting is a very polite way to put it. She is furious. And you have to remember her perspective. She's looking at all this as an artist, as someone trained to look at the visual evidence, while the men writing the history textbooks were largely coming from a theological or Victorian-era academic background.
And she points out the language of bias, which for me was so eye-opening. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it everywhere.
It's what I call the semantics of suppression. It's subtle, but incredibly effective. For example, she asks, why is the worship of the Hebrew god Yahweh called a religion, but the worship of the goddess is almost always referred to as a cult?
Cult definitely has a negative connotation. It sounds small, weird, maybe a little primitive, like people in robes drinking Kool-Aid.
Exactly. It delegitimizes it from the very first word. Or consider the artifacts themselves. When archaeologists dig up a statue of a male figure, it's cataloged as a deity, a god, an object of reverence.
Right.
But when they find a female figure, especially if she has prominent breasts, what is she called? An idol, or worse, a fetish.
Fetish has such a dirty sexual connotation to it.
It's meant to. It diminishes the subject. It pushes it into the realm of the primitive, the sexual, the other. Whereas religion is presented as serious, organized, intellectual, and usually male. Stone's point is that before we can even learn the history, we have to unlearn the biased vocabulary we've been given to describe it.
And then on top of the vocabulary, there's the outright sexual double standard in how they interpret the myths themselves. This part of the book really got me.
It's glaring, isn't it? In the ancient texts, the goddess is often a very powerful, sexually autonomous figure. She creates life, she takes lovers, she selects her own consorts.
And how did the male academics of the 19th and 20th centuries describe this?
They'd call her immoral. They invented terms like the virgin harlot because they just could not wrap their heads around a female figure who could be both powerful and sexual without it being somehow dirty or contradictory.
But at the same time, when you have male gods like Zeus running around, seducing and often outright raping everything that moves.
He's described as virile or playful.
Playful! That is just infuriating. Oh, that's just Zeus being a rascal again.
It really reveals so much more about the historians than it does about the history, doesn't it?
It really does.
And Stone also highlights the critical mistranslation of the word Kadesh. In the ancient temples of the Near East, there were women known as Kadesh. The word literally translates to holy or sanctified, holy women.
Okay, sounds pretty straightforward.
But the early male archaeologists, steeped in their own cultural biases, translated it almost universally as ritual prostitutes.
Wow, so they took holy woman and just straight up turned it into temple prostitute. That's not a translation, that's a complete distortion.
It fundamentally changes our entire understanding of their role in society. They weren't selling sex for money. They were likely priestesses engaging in sacred rites, perhaps symbolic marriages, related to the great mystery of life and creation. But the Victorian-era mindset of the excavators couldn't compute that. They saw sex, they saw women in a religious context, and their minds immediately went to prostitute.
It's just a willful misreading of the evidence. And that leads to my favorite example in this whole section, because it's so absurd it almost feels like a sketch comedy about bad science. The reindeer skull incident.
Trickles. Oh, yes. It's a perfect case study in tragicomedy.
So walk us through that one.
Okay. So archaeologists in Europe find a grave from the Paleolithic era. Inside, there's a human skeleton, and arranged around it are these huge, impressive reindeer skulls.
Trophies.
That was the immediate conclusion. The lead archaeologist, a man named Jay Marriger, looks at this and writes something like, aha, clearly this is the grave of a great hunter, a master of the wild. These are his magnificent trophies.
A standard and reasonable initial assumption. Big skulls, must be a big hunter, probably a man.
Then the biological analysis of the skeleton comes back from the lab, and the skeleton is unequivocally female.
Cue the record scratch.
Exactly. Now, a logical person, a scientist, would look at that new data and say, wow, this is amazing. It turns out women were also great hunters in the Paleolithic. It revises our understanding.
But that's not what Merringer did.
Not even close. He goes back and rewrites his conclusion. He decides that since the skeleton is female, the reindeer skulls cannot possibly be trophies of her own skill.
So what are they then?
He speculates. Maybe they were offerings to her. Or maybe she was a sorceress and used them in rituals. Or perhaps they were just random debris that fell into the grave. Anything but the obvious conclusion.
He literally could not compute the data because it conflicted with his preconceived software. His bias was stronger than the physical evidence in front of him.
Precisely. His worldview had to be right, so the evidence must be wrong. And it's the exact same problem as the thinking man issue she brings up.
Right, the description from the archaeologist E. Anati.
Yes. He's looking at this incredibly complex, symbolic Paleolithic art depicting a goddess, and he describes it as definitive proof of the intellectual capacity of thinking man.
He just erases the woman from the equation.
He completely ignores the very real possibility. And what Stone would argue is the probability that women were the ones creating this art, that women were the ones doing the thinking, creating the theology. It's systematic erasure. It's not just forgetting something. It's actively looking at evidence of female power and rewriting it to fit a narrative where men are always the agents, the creators, the main characters.
Which brings us to the pivotal question of the whole deep dive. If women were the main characters, if the goddess was the supreme deity for tens of thousands of years, how do we lose her? Why aren't we all worshiping the Queen of Heaven today?
And that question moves us into the most dramatic part of Stone's work. Section 3, the invasion. And she does not pull any punches here. She describes a violent, deliberate, and successful overthrow.
This is the core of her historical argument, right?
Yeah.
She posits that starting around 2400 BC, there were these waves of invasions by Indo-European peoples from the north.
That's the theory.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate for a second. We've painted this picture of a kind of near utopia, a world where women had high status, goddesses reigned, societies were largely peaceful, and then suddenly the men arrive with swords and ruin everything. It feels a little cinematic, almost like a Hollywood movie script.
It does, and that's a fair critique. That's where we have to be careful with Stone's narrative and not oversimplify it. History's rarely that clean. But she isn't really talking about a single bad Tuesday where the bad guys showed up.
It's not one event.
No, she's tracking a migration and invasion pattern of various Indo-European tribes. It starts around 2400 BC and spans centuries, even millennia. And the archaeological difference between these incoming groups and the people they conquered is stark.
These are the northerners from the source material?
Right. And the existing goddess cultures were, generally speaking, agrarian. They were settled farmers. And crucially, many of their cities and towns were unfortified.
Which implies they weren't living in a state of constant warfare. They weren't expecting to be attacked.
Exactly. And then you have these incoming Indo-European groups. They're nomadic, pastoral people. They've domesticated the horse, which in ancient warfare is basically the equivalent of inventing the tank.
It gives you incredible speed and power.
You can move faster and strike harder than anyone on foot. They also have superior metalworking. They're bringing iron weapons into a Bronze Age world. And most importantly, they brought their own gods with them.
And these were not nurturing earth mothers.
Far from it. These were warrior gods, storm gods, sky gods, deities who lived on remote mountaintops and threw lightning bolts. They represented a hunter-warrior theology, which is fundamentally different from a planter-nurturer theology.
So it's a clash of technologies, a clash of lifestyles, and a clash of theologies all at once.
Yes. And Stone argues that you can actually trace the path of this conquest, not just by digging up burned cities, but by looking at how the myths themselves changed. It wasn't enough for them to just win on the battlefield. They had to win in the heavens, too. They didn't just burn the temples. They burned the stories. They rewrote the entire cosmic order to justify their newfound rule.
This is where it gets really fascinating for me, how they actively rewrote the sacred stories. The example she uses of Marduk and Tiamat is frankly horrific, but it illustrates this perfectly.
It's the primary Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. In the older original Sumerian stories, the figure of Tiamat is the great mother goddess. She represents the primordial, watery chaos from which all life is born. She's revered as the source of everything.
Okay, so she's the original creator.
Yes, but in the new myth, written after the invasions, she's transformed into a hideous monster, a raging sea dragon.
So she goes from being the mother of all to being Godzilla.
Exactly. And the hero of the new story is Marduk, this young, muscular, male warrior god. He rises up to challenge her, and he doesn't just defeat her. The story is incredibly graphic about how he brutalizes her. He shoots an arrow down her throat, which inflates and kills her. And then he takes her dead body and splits her carcass in two, like a fish, using one half to create the heavens and the other half to create the earth.
That is not subtle.
It's Political Propaganda 101, written as a sacred text. The message is crystal clear. The old order, the mother, is chaotic and monstrous. The new order, the male king, brings structure and life. It justifies the earthly conquest by creating a divine precedent. The male god literally builds his new world on the dead body of the goddess.
And then the Assyrians took it even one step further. They practiced what you might call the find-replace technique of theology.
Right. When the Assyrians conquered Babylon, they found these creation tablets, and they just took them, scratched out the name Marduk, and wrote in the name of their own chief god, Ashur.
Talk about lazy plagiarism. They didn't even bother to write their own story.
But it shows you what was important. The specific name of the male god didn't matter as much as the gender and the power dynamic. The core story male warrior god violently defeats female creator goddess had to be preserved. It was about establishing the permanent supremacy of the male deity.
But the ultimate takedown, the piece of propaganda that really stuck, the one that went viral and that we are all still living with today, is the story of Adam and Eve.
This is the absolute centerpiece of Stone's analysis. She reads the book of Genesis not as a divine revelation, but as a very clever and very effective piece of anti-goddess polemic. She argues it was written with the specific goal of dismantling the old goddess religion, piece by piece.
Let's unpack that, because it completely flips the whole Sunday school story on its head. Let's start with the serpent. Of all the animals in the garden, why a snake?
Okay, so you have to understand the context. In nearly all of the goddess religions of the ancient Near East, the serpent was a sacred animal.
Sacred. We think of it as evil.
The opposite. The serpent was a symbol of oracular wisdom and divine knowledge. It sheds its skin, so it represents rebirth and immortality. It was almost always depicted with the goddess herself. Think of the cobra goddess Uazit in Egypt, the protector of the pharaohs. The snake was her agent.
So in the old religion, the snake was a good guy. It was a symbol of the goddess's power and wisdom.
Exactly, it was her messenger. But in Genesis, what happens? The serpent is demoted. It becomes the deceiver. It's cursed to be the lowest of all beasts, forced to crawl on its belly forever. The authors took the most powerful sacred symbol of their rival religion and methodically demonized it.
That's a powerful propaganda move. It's like if a new religion came along today and made the Christian cross the symbol of ultimate evil.
It's exactly that. It immediately tells the people, that symbol you and your ancestors used to trust and revere, it's actually the source of all evil. It's trying to trick you and kill you.
A complete inversion. Okay, so that's the serpent. Then there's the fruit from the tree of knowledge.
And Stone argues that this is a direct attack on the goddess's traditional role as the provider of wisdom and counsel.
How so?
In the old faith, you would go to the priestess, the oracle in the goddess's temple, to seek wisdom and knowledge. It was seen as a divine gift. But in the new story from Genesis, listening to the serpent, the old symbol of wisdom, and seeking that knowledge is redefined. It's no longer a virtue, it's the original sin.
So the pursuit of goddess wisdom is reframed as the direct cause of all human suffering.
Precisely. And critically, it's Eve, the woman who listens. She's the one who is tempted, and she's the one who tempts the man.
And the punishment she receives for this, it is so incredibly specific. I want to read the verse from Genesis, because when you read it in this context, it's just chilling. God says to Eve, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing, and your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you."
That's the picker. He shall rule over you.
It's not a suggestion. It's a divine command.
And Stone argues this verse served as the divine mandate, the theological justification for the new patriarchal social order. It wasn't just, well, this is how society is now. It was God himself demands that it be this way, because woman messed everything up. In one story, it stripped women of their political power, their religious authority, and their social autonomy.
It's the ultimate gaslighting operation on a civilizational scale. You deserve to be oppressed, and here's a sacred story from God that proves it's your own fault.
And Stone makes one more controversial connection here. She links this intense antagonism specifically to the Levites, the Hebrew priestly caste.
What's her theory there?
She suggests, based on some cultural parallels, that the Levites might have had ancestral connections to the Indo-European ruling classes, similar to the Brahmin caste in India. She thinks this might explain why they were so uniquely and intensely hostile toward the local Canaanite goddess worship that was all around them. They saw themselves as theological and maybe even ethnic outsiders, trying to stamp out the indigenous faith.
Okay, this all feels incredibly compelling and also very heavy. Which I think brings us to the wait a minute portion of this deep dive. We've been presenting Stone's arguments, and they paint a very clear picture. But we have to take off the rose-colored glasses for a second and look at the critical perspectives.
Right, because history is rarely, if ever, black and white. And Stone's book, as groundbreaking and important as it was, isn't perfect.
And that review we have from Kirkus Reviews was, let's just say, it was not a fan.
No, they were quite biting. They called her book reckless conjecture and accused her of practicing history by selective evidence.
And we have to talk about the linguistic stuff. This seems to be the area where she stumbles the most, according to critics.
It is. And it's important to remember Stone was an art historian and a sculptor, not a trained historical linguist. And sometimes She plays a kind of word association game that just doesn't hold up under scrutiny.
The Nazis thing. We have to mention it because it's in the review.
Yeah, we do. It's a major misstep.
Yeah.
She tries to draw a linguistic line connecting the ancient Semitic word Nazi, which means something like lord or prince, to the rise of the Nazis in Germany.
Oof.
And she does a similar thing, trying to connect the biblical Hittites to Hitler.
That feels like a massive stretch.
It's more than a stretch. It's just incorrect. It's a false etymology.
Mm-hmm.
And when you put something like that in a serious history book, it gives the academic establishment a very easy excuse to dismiss the entire work. They can point to that and say, see, she's hysterical. She's just making things up.
It feels emotionally driven, like she's so angry at the patriarchy, and maybe justifiably so, that she starts seeing connections everywhere, even where they don't exist.
Exactly. But, and this is a very big but, does one bad etymology about Hitler disprove the archaeological evidence of 30,000 Venus figures?
No.
Does it change the fact that the Marduk myth literally describes the dismemberment of the female creator?
No. The statues are still there, the myths were still rewritten, the legal codes in ancient Sumer still list women as judges.
Right. The Kirkus Review calls it reckless conjecture. But a lot of modern anthropology and archaeology has largely vindicated her core thesis, that there was a major societal shift from female-centered to male-centered religion, and that it did correlate with a significant loss of status for women. She might have gotten some of the word origins wrong, but she seems to have gotten the fundamental arc of history right.
And speaking of the why of it all, our other sources, from Reddit and the Super Summary Guide, offer some really interesting alternative theories. They go beyond just mean men with swords invaded, because invasions happen all the time in history, but they don't always completely obliterate and replace the local religion.
Right. The invasion theory is powerful, and it's definitely part of the story, but it might not be the only explanation. The Reddit discussion brought up a really fascinating environmental theory.
Which is what?
The eruption of the Thera volcano.
Thera is the volcano on the island of Santorini in Greece.
Right? Yes. And around 1600 BC, it blew its top in one of the largest volcanic explosions in human history. It would have caused massive tsunamis, plunged the region into darkness with ash clouds, led to global cooling and widespread crop failures. A volcanic winter.
And how does that connect to the fall of the goddess?
Well, this catastrophe likely devastated, or at least severely weakened, the Minoan civilization on Crete. And the Minoans were one of the last great, powerful, and seemingly peaceful goddess-leaning cultures in the Mediterranean.
So, in a way, nature itself took out the goddess's last stronghold.
It could have destabilized the whole society. I mean, think about it. If your entire religion is based on a goddess who controls nature and ensures fertility, and then nature suddenly turns on you and kills everyone, you might start to think you need a new god. When people are starving and desperate, the peaceful ways of the past might start to look naive and weak.
That makes sense. And it links to another theory that came up, the warfare necessity theory. This one is pretty dark, but I can absolutely see the cold logic in it.
It's a very utilitarian argument. The idea is that as warfare scaled up, from small tribal skirmishes to massive kingdom-level conflicts for resources, you needed one thing above all else.
Bodies.
Bodies. You needed a constant supply of soldiers.
Now, where do soldiers come from? They come from women.
Exactly. In this view, women are reduced to breeding assets for the state. To maintain a large standing army, you need absolute strict control over reproduction. You need to ensure every woman is producing as many sons as possible for the state's military.
And that necessitates a strict patriarchal control over their bodies, their sexuality, their lives.
Absolutely. Women stop being revered as queens of heaven and start being viewed as essentially factories for warriors. Patriarchy in this model wasn't just born out of men hating women. It was a grim survival strategy for a world that had become consumed by large-scale war.
So the invaders win, they set up their new male warrior gods. But why does it stick? Why didn't people just go back to worshiping the goddess as soon as the soldiers marched on to the next town?
That is the crucial question.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the idea of a fundamental psychological shift.
Right.
The mythologist Joseph Campbell talks about the distinction between what he calls planter logic and hunter logic.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. In a planter agricultural society, the magic is in the earth. It's mysterious. You put a tiny, dead-looking seed into the dark ground, and through some invisible internal process, life emerges. It's the magic of the womb. It's female.
Okay.
In a hunter or warrior society, the magic is in the kill. It's in the weapon. It's an act of external force and penetration. It's aggressive, it's outward, and it's male.
And as societies shifted from prioritizing farming to prioritizing conquest, the entire concept of power shifted from the womb to the spear.
Exactly. We started to need a god who could lead armies, not just a goddess who could grow corn. We traded the mother for the general. And once that switch flips in the human psyche, once power becomes defined by dominance and control rather than creation and nurturing, is a very, very hard switch to flip back.
Which leads us directly into our final section, the legacy. Because despite all of this, the invasions, the rewritten myths, the propaganda, the bad press, she didn't disappear completely, did she? The goddess.
No, not at all. Stone makes a great point that the worship of the Queen of Heaven persisted for a very long time, often right under the noses of the new patriarchal prophets.
There's that great, almost comical detail she pulls from the Bible itself where the prophet Jeremiah is complaining about it.
Yes, it's in the book of Jeremiah. He is absolutely furious because he sees the Hebrew women in the streets baking special cakes as offerings for the Queen of Heaven.
And he tells them to stop.
He does. He tells them they're angering God. They basically tell him to get lost.
Yeah.
They say to him, and it's right there in the text, no, when we worshipped her, we had plenty of food and we were well. Since we stopped worshiping her and started listening to you, we have wanted for everything and have been consumed by the sword and by famine.
They were looking at the data. They were saying, our lived experience is that life was better under the goddess.
It's an incredible moment of popular resistance. And even much later, as Christianity began to dominate Europe, those powerful goddess attributes had to go somewhere. The human need for them didn't just vanish.
So they were assimilated.
Completely. Many of the titles and characteristics of the Egyptian goddess Isis, the Divine Mother, the Compassionate Intercessor, the Queen of Heaven, were absorbed directly into the figure of the Virgin Mary, or they were parceled out to various female saints.
It's like energy in physics. It can't be created or destroyed, only transferred or transformed.
The human psychological need for divine feminine presence didn't go away. It just got rebranded and crucially put under new male management.
But Stone's final point is that the damage was already done. The new myths had already taken deep root in our collective psyche.
The psychological impact is profound, and she argues it's the most lasting legacy. We are conditioned by these stories from the moment we're born. The Eve stereotype, the idea that women are inherently more gullible, morally weaker, sexually dangerous, and ultimately in need of male control, is baked into the very foundation of Western culture.
It's the water we swim in. Even if you aren't religious yourself, you know the story. You know that woman caused the fall of man. You see echoes of it in pop culture, in politics, in the way we still talk about and treat powerful female leaders.
And you have to compare that archetype to the goddess archetype that it replaced. Wise, creator, lawgiver, powerful. We lost that as a primary role model for what divinity and what femininity could be. We traded the lawmaker for the temptress.
I was reading through that Witches vs. Patriarchy subreddit thread, and the sentiment there was really moving. It wasn't just intellectual anger, it was a palpable sense of grief.
Grief is exactly the right word for it.
People were talking about this deep desire to reclaim those goddess vibes. There's this dawning realization for many people that the history we were all taught was written by the victors, in this case, by men, and that the traditional gender roles we live with today might not be so natural after all. They're political.
It's a desire to reconnect with a lineage that was intentionally cut off. To have this realization that female power isn't some modern invention or a historical anomaly, but that it was actually the bedrock of human civilization for millennia. It really changes how you walk through the world if you believe that your deep ancestors weren't just a spare rib, they were gods.
So after all of that, what does this all mean? Let's try and wrap this up in our outro. We've covered Stone's explosive thesis, the deep bias in archaeology, the invasion theories, the deconstruction of the Adam and Eve propaganda, and the modern fallout.
I think the big synthesis here is that religion and myth are not just quaint old stories. They are powerful tools of social order. And whether Merlin Stone was 100% right about every specific date or every linguistic link matters less than her much broader, and I think undeniable, point. The stories we tell ourselves about the nature of the divine directly define who holds power on Earth.
And for you listening, the so what of all this is pretty huge. At its core, this entire body of work challenges the deeply ingrained idea that male dominance is divinely ordained or biologically inevitable.
Exactly. If you can accept that patriarchy had a start date, that it was installed, often through violence and very clever propaganda, then you also have to accept that it can have an end date, It's not biology, it's history, and history can be changed.
It also encourages all of us to read those objective history books with a much more critical eye. When you read about thinking man creating art or ritual prostitutes in ancient temples, you have to stop and ask, who wrote this and what were they afraid of?
That critical thinking is the ultimate takeaway. Always question the official narrative.
So I want to leave everyone with a final provocative thought to chew on. Merlin Stone argues that the story of the fall of man, the Adam and Eve story, was a brilliant piece of political propaganda designed specifically to strip women of their power about 3,000 years ago. And it worked so well that many of us still believe it on some level today. So my question for you is this. What modern myths or natural truths are we all accepting today that are actually just political tools in disguise?
That is a question worth a deep dive all of its own.
It sure is. Thanks for exploring the lost history of the goddess with us today. Keep digging, everyone.
Until next time.